You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We're joined today by Jamie Gehring, author and neighbor to Ted Jaczynski, the Unabomber. Jamie's here to talk about her book, Madman in the Woods, Life Next Door to the Unabomber. Jamie, thank you for joining us on Mind Over Murder.
Thank you so much for having me.
So start by telling us a little bit about your personal and professional background.
Of course, by the title of the book, Madman in the Woods, Life Next Door to the Unabomber, you can tell that I grew up next to Ted Jaczynski, the Unabomber, in rural Montana. That's where my life started. I was 16 when Ted was arrested in 1996. After that, life went on as normal as it could be. I graduated college, got married, had children, and I was in finance for many years until I really just felt the pull to finally write this book.
What actually prompted you to write this after, what prompted you specifically to go, wait, now is the time to write this down?
I was just at an event back at one of my homes in California, and an old friend of mine mentioned that not a lot of people actually do what they say they're going to do in high school. And I, of course, had said, I really want to write this book. She was like, I wanted to be a singer on a cruise ship, and I'm not a singer on a cruise ship. But you actually wrote this. So I've always wanted to, but it was a different course of events. It was a combination of things. So I had chosen to finally sit down and really outline and start writing these scenes from my childhood, knowing that I really wanted to put this book together and not really knowing exactly how it was going to look or what the structure was going to be. I was experiencing some difficulties in my life as well. My father had passed away from cancer. My sister passed away at only 24. I think I was also at the time grasping to make sense of things and heal from different things in my life as well. That kind of pushed me because I've always wanted to tell my father's story and his role in the capture of Ted. Then at the same time, the Netflix documentary, Unabomber in His Own Words, was in the very beginning stages. They had reached out to me. And as I was telling the producers my story, they just kept saying, you have to finish this book. You really do. This perspective that you can offer is one of a kind and truly is a story that hasn't been told before. So you promise you'll finish this. They were incredibly supportive. It was the one thing that really pushed me to share my story with the world, because that's a vulnerable place to be.
It's one of the things that I really enjoyed. We were saying this off air is that you're really struggling with this dual nature of Ted Jaczynski. On the one hand, he gave you gifts. He spent time with your family. And then on the other hand, he's a domestic terrorist. And as you iterate in the book, he killed your dog. He sabotaged your father's businesses. It's got to be a real struggle to deal with this idea that I know this person and he seems nice. And on the other hand, he's a cold-blooded killer. I really like the way that you iterated how hard that was for you to come to terms with it. I think it's beautifully done.
So thank you for saying that. I'm really glad that you connected with that part in the book because it definitely is a huge theme. I will say that some of the feedback I had gotten about the book initially, especially if someone was only into the book about 4 or 5 chapters, they would definitely say there's almost like too much sympathy for this person. He's a killer.
Yeah.
But you know what? It's honest. It's the child inside of me that I'm looking back on, of course, through the eyes of an adult, but that's real. That's honest memories of this person who was in our minds in those early years, just the eccentric neighbor Teddy who brought gifts and came to dinner at the house. that's how I remember him in the beginning. And of course, as the book goes on, as life goes on, those things change and my idea of him changes. But that's just coming from that honest little girl kind of remembering those moments, and they're human moments.
For the benefit of the listeners, how old are you as a child when you first met? I've never even heard anyone call him Teddy, by the way. You're the first. How old are you when you first meet this neighbor? And by the way, we should probably make a little bit clearer how spread out things are. In other words, being a neighbor in Montana is not the same as being a neighbor in a big city.
Yeah, just a little bit of background on the area. It is about 1,000 residents, the town of Lincoln, Montana. So it's very small, very close-knit, but also there are plenty of people that live off-grid and choose a simpler lifestyle, and it's very accepted. Particularly, my family lived only a quarter mile from Ted, and he actually purchased the property. Him and his brother David purchased the property in 1971 from my grandfather. Our family had a very large ranching operation in Lincoln, Montana, and my grandfather had decided to sell just 1.4 acre in which our ranch land surrounded. And it was Ted and David that bought that property. And of course, he was there from 1971 to 1996 when he was arrested. I was born in 1980. So that, of course, I don't remember when Ted was holding me as a baby. I don't remember him coming to dinner as a small child, but I was able to sit down with my mom and hear those stories. My first memory of Ted was when I was around 4, because it was the summer before I started kindergarten, so I could remember specifically how old I was. That's when my memories of him really started.
Do you know why your grandfather would choose to sell such a small plot of land to the Jaczynskis? There wasn't a lot of economic benefit in selling 1.4 acre. Do you know why he did it?
It was a piece of property that he didn't need for his ranching operation. At the time, he just needed a little bit of cash. And so from time to time, he would sell little pieces of
Small
property
plots of
as
land.
needed.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
And so that is why that piece was sold back then.
Now, the Jaczynski property, we've seen photographs of it, and of course, we've talked to Fitz about it, and he's described the property. It's quite small, and there is no electricity running to the cabin, and you're about a quarter of a mile away. I assume your parents' house, since there was a family there, was a bit larger.
Yes, our home was a 2-story log cabin. We had running water. We had electricity. We lived we were rural, but we lived a much more modern life than Ted had. And so that was an interesting question that I posed in the book is with Ted Jaczynski knowing that there's this warm home, homemade dinners, and the comforts that are afforded by things like electricity, only a quarter mile away through the years, always knowing that he could come over and have dinner with us, it is interesting to look at that and know that that stopped. So that stopped probably mid-'80s was the last time that happened. Of course, he was arrested in 96. So that's a large span of time that he knew that he could have sought some type of comfort in our family and our home. And he chose not to. He chose to hunt grouse and rabbit and porcupine and live off the land.
Do you know why Ted Jaczynski stopped socializing with your family? What was going on in the mid-'80s that he was no longer willing to come over for the occasional dinner?
From my perspective, he did start to change. And as he went deeper into, in my opinion, his psychosis, he was deeper into his reign of domestic terror. He didn't have the space, I don't believe, to put himself in a position where he was sitting at a dining room table with a family making small talk. That wasn't part of his motive at the time. He had already established to us at least a cover of just the strange neighbor. And he probably didn't feel the need as much to continue that with us. And I do believe that that was part of the reason. Yes, maybe he did have some sort of need for social interaction in those early years. But I believe, too, it was most likely part of that methodical planning of showing these neighbors that he's nothing to worry about. He's just the odd, shy neighbor next door.
I remember reading a portion of the book where you were discussing the time that you actually started to be afraid of Ted coming to the door, because he used to come to your door and ask for the time, which I thought was like, wow, this guy doesn't even have a watch. He doesn't have a clock. That's crazy. But I remember that there was a point where you were talking about the day that you became afraid to see him. Do you remember what kicked off that fear? Like, what was it that kind of made you go, all right, not good, danger, Will Robinson?
I think that remembering back, it was a combination of things. So it was Ted's pace. It was the way he looked and the way our home was set up. There was a long rectangular window in the front of our home for quite some time. And when he would come by, you could sometimes see him peeking his head through that window and you could see him before he got to the front door. And I remember it wasn't quite the Ted that you see in 1996 when he was arrested, where his clothes are decaying
and the hair
and his hair is just all over the place. He's emaciated, but it was on the way to being that Ted. And just his look was terrifying. His hair is all over the place. He's dirty. He's in a hurry. He's not the Ted that came over bringing me rocks when I was 4 and was patient and quiet and a little bit odd. He had just changed. And I guess I picked up on that. And then also I'm older. So I'm also understanding more of the world around me as well. And so that probably played into it. I know that bad things happen in the world at this point, and I know that my parents aren't home. And this guy, although he's a neighbor and I've known him for years, I can tell that he just seems different and scary.
How did your parents feel about Ted? Did they ever discuss him in front of you?
Yes, there were a lot of discussions about Ted. And so my parents are divorced. My mom left in the early 80s. Her and Ted actually, I mean, even when she was interviewed by the FBI many years later, she remembered him as being shy, but respectful, and of course would never have suspected he was capable of committing crimes. My stepmother, though, however, in the later years, she, of course, never suspected Ted of being the Unabomber or committing crimes, but there was a different relationship with them. And she honestly just never really liked him. She felt like he was pretty disrespectful to women in general when he was around, and they never really got along. And so that was definitely a topic of conversation in our home. And my dad had different scary interactions with Ted, disagreements over the years. That had also been a topic of conversation. So there, looking back, of course, there were some red flags with him as a person, but of course, never making that jump to this hermit living in a 10 by 12 cabin with no running water, no electricity, just a strange man being the Unabomber, holding a nation captive for 17 years. There was never, and everybody, we were all shocked, completely shocked when we found out.
I think in an interesting way, your parents' divorce and your father's remarriage, your birth mom, your mom, and your stepmom, it's interesting because of the timing of it. Their perceptions of Jaczynski are so different because that change that you described, and by the mid-'80s, he's starting to get, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like he grew more eccentric, more withdrawn, and your stepmother, who comes along obviously afterward, marries your father, moves in. She never liked Ted, whereas your mother, who knew Ted at an earlier point, it sounds like she had more positive perceptions of Ted Jaczynski as a neighbor. It sounds like a stretch to call him a friend, but he was the neighbor down the road, and she seemed to have a more positive view of him than your stepmother did a few years later.
Yes, you're 100% correct about that. Ted, even his appearance in those early years, so late 70s, early 80s, was much more like the Berkeley professor. than the deranged hermit that was pulled from his cabin in 1996. And so as the years went on, of course, his appearance had changed, but he was also changing. And I will add to that because it was really interesting. I was just in Montana as part of my book tour for Madman in the Woods. And there was a couple who came to my signing who had known Ted and had seen him the last time in the mid 80s. And they had even mentioned that they had known him for years. They had mentioned they saw the change then. So even as an adult and after writing this book was validating to hear somebody else's perspective that I hadn't even known until that day was the same as me as a little kid.
It's very interesting because I was thinking about something. Jaczynski, for most of us, millions and millions of Americans, Kristin and me included, and people all over the world, he's this unknown. And I think about his definition in most people's minds, certainly in mine, is all based on the written word. The so-called manifesto and the books and your book now joining the interesting kind of scholarly viewpoint of this man who starts out as a professor and a brilliant man and ends up taking himself somehow internally on a journey that made him an extremist and ultimately a terrorist. And yet very few of us have even really heard him speak much, if at all. I was thinking when you were saying that, Jamie, that there are not a long list of people that actually spoke with Jaczynski. Do you remember like what his voice sounded like? And did he sound like a college professor, super articulate and brilliant? What was he like?
So there's many nights that I have spent reworking scenes or revising the book in which they were scenes from age 4, like when he's bringing me the rocks. And I remember the way he spoke to me. I remember what his voice sounded like to me because I really needed to like call upon that to remember the emotions that I was feeling and really just search for the meaning in that interaction. And yes, and that is the other really interesting thing. And again, why I was pulled to finally write this book is our family. And of course, I was 16, but our family spent 25 years next to this man. And so in that time, there were many interactions. And we were, of course, right there during his entire reign of domestic terror. Looking back on it with that perspective as well, it's just such a unique and interesting layer of the story because you're right. There weren't people that were interacting with this man, especially during that time, not even his family. We were, and very select people in the community were the only ones that were sitting down and having conversations with this man while he was also testing bombs and sending bombs to around the United States.
So it's pretty clear that you had to do an extensive amount of research to back up your personal experiences with Ted Jaczynski. And so you describe in here sitting down with various FBI agents, including our friend Fitz. I know you read through the Unabomber's journals. I know you talked to his brother. What would you say are like maybe the 2 or 3 most surprising things that you learned about Ted in doing your research for this book?
The first one was just the backstory of what created Ted. And so I had heard about his hospital experience. I had heard about the Harvard experiments, but not too much about them. And so when I really decided myself that I needed to understand or try at my best, at least, to understand this person and what created him, to reconcile my own experience with him, that was probably the most surprising. And honestly, it made much more sense. With Ted, in my opinion, it wasn't just one thing. It was the perfect storm, underlying mental illness, a separation from his mother at a very vulnerable time in his life at 9 months. He was advanced at school multiple times. He never really felt connected or understood by his peers. He always felt out of place. He always felt a little bit isolated, a little bit off. And then he went to Harvard at such a young age, and he was there volunteering for these experiments at only 16. And for a person who didn't pride himself so much on his ideals, his intellect, then that it may not have caused any sort of issue. But for Ted specifically, I believe that was a very difficult thing to put that particular person through. And so I would say just the combination of what created this man was surprising. And then additionally, there's some things that I unearthed that are pretty difficult. My dog, of course, being poisoned, and reading the letter that Ted had wrote to the newspaper admitting to poisoning a dog that was sneaking into his garden at night. And this was after his arrest. So we hadn't known for sure that Ted was doing these things until he was behind bars and I was writing this book. And then of him pointing a gun at my sister and him contemplating killing my stepmother and my sister. And that was the first time that I saw something in my research that was that deeply personal and confirmed that we were in danger. It wasn't just local acts of sabotage. It wasn't just sanding a sawmill or destroying a cabin or even poisoning a dog. It was at that point really somebody considering murdering my family. And I would say that was another very shocking and surprising thing.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. How did you end up finding out things like that after the fact, that he had considered killing your stepmother and sister, and some of the very dark thoughts that he had clearly had?
So that specifically was something that my parents, I think, probably chose just not to really share with me. At an earlier age, I was 16, and they probably didn't think it was appropriate to tell that particular story. But it was actually while writing the book and speaking with my stepmother, and then her telling this story too on the Netflix documentary, it was finally, she felt comfortable enough. I'm an adult at this point to share that story. And so that, it was just part of the research process while writing this.
Something I've wondered about when we've talked to Jim Fitzgerald, former FBI profiler and author, about Ted Jaczynski as well, we talked about Jaczynski would travel great distances, typically by bus, with these homemade explosives, we think under the seat. You can imagine just how bizarre that would be. Jaczynski's coming and going. He would have to take buses for many hours. He went to other cities. He went as far as the West Coast to throw off investigators in terms of where these packages were being mailed from. Tell us a little bit about the topography, the layout of your family's house and his house. If Jaczynski had been coming and going, would your family have been able to tell that he was leaving the house for days on end and then coming back? Would the land lend itself to those observations?
So that is a really interesting question as well. The way that Ted's home was situated, he was in pretty dense trees. And when he would go into town, when I say town, that's Lincoln, Montana, 4 miles from where his cabin was, he would either walk or ride his bike. And the road that left his home into the town of Lincoln would pass right by my father's little sawmill. That was even closer. The sawmill was even closer to Ted's house than our actual home was. And so we would many times see Ted going by on his bike or walking. And sometimes if he was coming back from town, we would offer him a ride and he would get in the car and we would drop him off when we arrived home. Him coming and going was not strange because he went to the library. He went into town sometimes to get supplies. He had to run errands just like anybody else did. Sometimes he went to the post office let me qualify that. He went to the post.
But he wasn't mailing bombs from there.
No, he was not. He was going to pick up a package from his mother who had sent something that was too large to fit in his mailbox, those types of things. The coming and going was not an odd thing. And it didn't happen really frequently, but it did happen. He actually would not take a bus directly from Lincoln either. He would ride in with the mail person to a larger town, for instance, Helena. And that is where he would stay and go to Aunt Bonnie's books and shop and spend the evening and then get cleaned up. And then the next day he would go out on a Greyhound and plant these bombs. And we're never seeing him at a bus stop. We're just seeing him go in and out from the little town of Lincoln, Montana, which you do.
And you just said something I'd never heard before. Did Jaczynski have a mailbox at his house?
He did have a mailbox at his house. Yes.
And so there was rural free delivery on your road. In other words, the postman or woman came by and dropped off the mail.
That is correct. He had a mailbox. It even had his last name on it. And I have a picture of that. It's a strange picture to look at to see, because on a mailbox on the side of our rural little road there.
Wow. Talk a little bit about your relationship with, we've already mentioned Jim Fitz, who's one of our favorite people. And then you also worked with FBI agent Max Noel. What insights were they able to offer you about Ted that kind of helped you in writing this book?
I feel so fortunate that the people that were so involved in this case, in this investigation, in this iconic time in history, were able to provide so much support to me while writing this, because I wanted to tell my story, but I also wanted to tell parts of the narrative that I wasn't present for. And so I was able to get a really interesting perspective and additional information from both Fitz and Max Noel. One of the elements of my conversations with Max Noel that really added to the story is that he was pretty close with my dad and worked pretty closely together during the months before the arrest. Since my father had passed away, I was able to hear all of these stories about my dad from Max Noel. And so that was personally gratifying, but it was also a really incredible element to add to the book.
In a way, with your father's passing, it had to feel good on some level to hear some of those stories from Agent Noel about how they'd worked together. Did you find it emotional to listen to the work that they'd done?
It was emotional, but not in a way that made me sad. It was in a way that really made me proud. And as he told the stories, I really felt my dad. I think, and of course, the book also goes into that like universal theme of grief. It does. I think that was, although it's not a top theme in the book, it's definitely a part of it because it was a part of my own journey, my own healing while writing the book is dealing with the grief of my father and the grief of my sister. And those stories, I think, were very healing and really powerful.
And for the benefit of our listeners, talk just a little bit. I know you can't go into the whole entire story, but give us a basic overview of how your dad essentially helped to catch the Unabomber.
High level, my father was approached by the FBI prior to Ted's arrest, and it was Agent Max Noel who they had conversations and they were feeling each other out. And of course, Max was there to gather intel, to understand where Ted lived, the people around him. And also there was probably a part of him that wanted to make sure there weren't people around him that were involved in helping him, especially because when writes to the FBI and to the papers, he's saying we, and he's making it sound like it's a group of domestic terrorists.
Right.
Yes.
And so I'm sure that was part of, and Max has never actually said that out loud to me, but just knowing kind of, what they were looking for, it's always made me wonder. But anyway, they were very quickly able, both of them, my father and Max, to ascertain that they could trust each other. From then on, my dad really provided a lot of intel back to Max, the comings and goings of Ted, and if there were footprints or if there was smoke coming out of the chimney. So they just could understand where this person was while they were gathering up the resources to capture him. And then, of course, they were having some difficulty with being able to view the property. And my dad really stepped in and offered some advice, and then additionally recorded videotaped the terrain around Ted's home and even Ted's cabin in preparation of the arrest. So the FBI agents would be able to see what that looked like.
Do you know if the equipment that your father used to record the video, was that something that your family had or that the FBI provided?
It's funny because it was a 1990s model, like Sony video camera that my dad had, that he would also use to record Christmas morning or A Day at the Lake. And I will. So I actually, if you've seen Unabomber in his own words, there is the footage of my father recording around Ted's property. And that actually I was able to get, not because my dad saved it, but because I was able to request it from the FBI. They did.
Wow.
They sent it. It took a long time, but yes, they did send it to me. And I had to laugh because when I first started watching it, it was a day at the lake.
Oh, no. On the same tape?
And so it's my dad and his friends, and they're all having a great time out at the lake. And then it cuts like a little bit into Christmas, and then it stops. Like the lines come across, halt, and then we are.
It's on the same videotape.
It's on the same one. Here we are at the Unabomber's home. It is wild.
So it's shot with the family camcorder. That's what they called them back then.
Yes.
And on the same videotapes that the lake and Christmas and other things would have been shot.
Yes,
I think
exactly.
That's hysterical. I was thinking the FBI provides your dad with this super high-tech latest version of recording equipment. But no, he actually gets out the family camcorder and starts recording.
No. And I will say this too, everything, Ted was methodical, but everything that the FBI did was very methodical as well. They did that on purpose because if my dad, Butch Gehring, the Sawyer, this guy that he knows, comes out with this highly advanced piece of equipment, and Ted saw him, would be like, what is going on? But no, my dad out there with his camcorder held at his waist out. Of course, Ted did not see him, but if he did, he would have been like, oh, I'm just recording my property lines, or there's some game out here I'm looking for, something like that. So that I'm sure that was thought of.
Were there other neighbors nearby that would have had any view of Jaczynski's cabin and adjoining property?
There was a hunting cabin that was pretty close to Ted's, and that was actually used as the staging cabin and where they held Ted after he was arrested. There wasn't any full-time residents that had a view of Ted's home.
Interesting.
So, Jamie, I became familiar with you because I listened to Where the Devil Belongs on Audible, which is from our friends at XG Productions. And that's how I first heard your story. And so then, of course, when I heard that you had a book, I was like, I am all in for this. This is great. I love this. How did you get involved with XG and that production? And do you feel like that was that emotionally fulfilling for you to be involved with this and to be able to tell your story?
It was. And I was approached by James Clemente, and he told me about this project and who was participating and what it was going to look like and really the story they wanted to tell. And it was so much different than the book I was writing, but I also felt like my contribution would be important. And yes, I chose to participate. I think they did a great job, and it was a really great friendship as well. Jim Clemente's great, and he actually blurbed my book, and
I saw that.
Which is always like the highest compliment. Yeah, I'm actually very grateful that he did reach out.
Did you go to XG Studios in Culver City to record your audio, or did you record it remotely?
I recorded remotely, actually in Boulder, Colorado.
And you're living in Colorado now?
Yes.
Do people still stop you and want to talk to you about the Unabomber? This has been such a subject of fascination for so many people.
I think when somebody finds out about what my book is about or has watched the document, there are definitely people that still have questions and they want to know, what does it look like? What does it feel like to live next to this man? And even I did a book club last night, and these women had already read the book, but they still had, like our conversation, they still had so many questions on a personal level. And yes, I guess the answer is yes to that. There are still people that want to know more and want a deeper understanding of this.
Now with Madman in the Woods out, and you're out doing this podcast and a bunch of promotional appearances, are people coming out of the woodwork? One of the things Kristin and I have been talking about is with the Colonial Parkway Murders, my sister's case. We're actively looking for tips and information, which we're then feeding to the FBI and the Virginia State Police as appropriate. We've also found that, I don't know how else to put this, a lot of oddballs out there who come forward with information. Now, obviously, the Unabomber case was solved and Ted Jaczynski will spend the rest of his life in jail. Are there times when you think to yourself, uh-oh, here we go again, when people reach out to you or come to a book signing or whatever, and you think to yourself, I think we're crossing the line here into oddball territory?
Definitely. There's definitely.
Why did I know you were going to go there?
We're not surprised.
I'm not even going to hesitate there. There's definitely that factor and that element. I think it presents itself much more online than in person, which isn't surprising, but there's quite a bit of those situations after I participated in the documentary.
Yeah.
And of course, there's people all over the spectrum where some people believe that he was a hero. Some people believe that he was the Zodiac killer.
We can get Kristin going on this one.
I don't believe it. Like, for the record, I don't believe that, but I've heard that a number of times. Yeah.
And it was one thing where I started getting like so many emails about this.
Man.
And I reached out to my friends at the FBI and I'm like, what are your thoughts on this? Because I don't even want to go down this rabbit hole, honestly. The consensus was like, it was so many years ago, the FBI compared the writings. They decided that Ted Jaczynski, not only based on writing, but on like specific locations, he was not a suspect. And also, in my opinion, of course, the later years, he talks about wanting to commit wants to commit homicide at close range and things like that. But that's much later. And I don't think in those earlier years, he would have been capable of killing in that way. But anyway, sorry to
go down that
road.
One of the things that I really enjoyed reading in the book was the fact that you had reached out to Ted. And as I got closer and closer to the end, I was like, oh, she had to have written to Ted. She had to have. And then you did. And I was like, yes, all right, this is great. But that must have been a little bit of a letdown, that final letter from him, especially that particularly ironic statement where he directed you to Amazon for his books. Did you try for any further correspondence with Ted after that? Or were you just, that's all I'm going to get from him?
I did continue to correspond, but not with those expectations.
Okay.
When I was initially looking for that kernel of good, still wanting to know, has this time in prison changed his perspective? And maybe he does have answers. And we look at our society, all these school shootings, the use of technology, all of these issues that we have. Is there some sort of answer in there? Can Ted offer anything to this dialogue? And yes, of course, by the letter that wasn't. My questions were not answered, but I still, it was important to me that I told him that I was writing a book. And so I did send him a letter explaining that. And then when he was moved to Butner FMC from the Supermax here in Florence, I also, this might sound crazy, but I sent him a Goodwill card because I always think of Ted's brother, David, and how much he still hopes that he will find some sort of peace in his heart and some sort of forgiveness for himself, although many people probably will never forgive him, and that's okay, but just within him. And so I'm always thinking of David in that way. And so I think that probably was a reason that I sent a card hoping that he was feeling better.
Has he sent anything back since then?
It was one letter, and I don't think he'll probably write again, especially now knowing that I wrote a book. You know, I've also been on book tour, so I haven't been to the post office to see. Okay. Yeah, I need to follow up and see if he sent anything back. But I do foresee him reviewing the book, because just about every book that he has read that's been written about him or article, he definitely has something to say about it. So I expect that.
I did want to ask that. To your knowledge, he would ultimately have access to a copy of Madman in the Woods, your book, and be able to read it?
Yes, not electronically, but he would be able to read the physical book.
A hard copy of the book.
Wow.
Yes.
As he has responded to other writing about his case, so he may actually respond in some way. He clearly has the time.
He does. He did mention he doesn't, in his last letter, he doesn't have a lot of time. He's very busy.
What's he busy doing?
Oh, Unabomber, thanks.
It was a very flip response, and it was much shorter than I had anticipated. I thought there was going to be a long screed, but no, he was just like, and buy my book on Amazon.
I love how all of us do beg off with, I'm really busy right now. And it's usually true. I'm a little bit baffled how Ted Jaczynski thinks that he's too busy to read your book.
Yeah. When you read the back of the letter in the epilogue, that might answer some questions.
It was very interesting. So, Jamie, I'm curious, do you consider yourself and your family members survivors of Ted Jaczynski? I don't know if that's an appropriate term, but if it isn't, help me find another one. What do you consider yourself in relation to Ted?
So I've been asked that before, and I have a tough time answering that because there are true survivors of Ted Jaczynski.
Yes.
And there are family members of people that didn't survive Ted Jaczynski. And so for me to even consider myself in the same class as them, I can't. I just can't, because they were such violent, horrific acts that changed generations of families. And no, I guess I can't. But at the same time, I feel like we are lucky. We're lucky that we were so close to him, and he knew that if he committed such acts of violence so close to home, then he would be captured probably much sooner. I can't say that we were survivors of Ted Jaczynski, but I will say we're pretty darn lucky that we did survive all of those years.
I think that's a great
place to close answer. If you want.
Yeah, so the book is Madman in the Woods, Life Next Door to the Unabomber by Jamie Gehring. Jamie, where can we find your book?
You can find my book just about anywhere books are sold. You can find it online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your favorite brick and mortar stores. And also you can listen to it on Audible. And especially if you want to spend 10 hours with yours truly, you can listen to it there.
I did listen to it on Audible in addition to reading it. And I took many walks and runs around my neighborhood with your voice in my ear. So that was really an excellent use of 10 hours, I must say.
Oh, thank you so much for reading and listening. Oh my gosh, that makes me so happy.
This was really just a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it. And it is a very different picture of the Unabomber than any I've seen before. So I think this is a wonderful addition to anybody's true crime library. That's going to wrap it up for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. And Jamie, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.